Maybe who's going to get get what car to drive, temporary restraining orders if there's physical violence or somebody's being threatening something. Maybe there's going to be some temporary restraining orders. So those kind of things. There's what's called a motion for pre-decree relief, or meaning exactly what it says. Prior to the actual divorce decree itself, you have to get these pre-decree items ironed out initially, and those are expensive, but early on kind of hearings, you can get to those within a month.
Wow. Okay. This is all new to me. I mean, I'm pretty sure people have never heard of that as well.
Well, again, controlling the pre-decree rulings is crucial. If you get temporary custody, you're more likely to get full custody.
Right.
So sometimes getting the jump on these pre-decree rulings is crucial.
Oh, okay. And then here we're going to cover issues like property settlements, key property items. So I'll just let you take over on that.
Well, the ones that I discussed briefly earlier, the main information gathering. In Hawaii, people's houses are the big enchilada most of the time. That's the biggie. And real property can be handled a couple of different ways. If the parties themselves, again, that all through this, there's the theme. When I wrote my book called Divorce with Decency, and we should probably show people a copy of that one of these times. But the theme behind that is to try and reach your own agreement and do it expeditiously and economically. Don't get stuck in the quicksand of the whole contested litigation if you can possibly help it. If parties can agree and come into the court and say, Judge, husband's going to buy wife out of the house, he's got X amount of time to do it, he's going to take over the mortgage, he's going to pay her $300,000 for her 50-50 share of the net equity, and the court says, okay, if you guys have got that figured out, they'll gladly approve that. Conversely, if both sides want to buy each other out of the house and they can't agree on a price and they can't agree on much of anything, or can't get refinancing for so as to take the other one off the mortgage, the court is not going to get into the real estate business. They're not going to say, well, it sounds like your appraiser, Mrs. Larita, just to pick one name at random, it sounds like your house appraiser has the better number than his appraiser, so we're going to go with your number and we'll let you buy the house for X amount. They're not going to make those kind of rulings. They got 5,000 cases going through family court during any given year in Hawaii.
Now, you as an attorney, well, how do you get involved in that part, or no?
Well, you try and make an intelligent assessment of what the buyout ought to be, and you tell the clients, hey, look, if you guys can decide this, that's fine. If you can't reach a decision on it, the court is just going to say sell the property on the open market, because then it solves all the issues as to how much the house is worth, right? The person comes in and pays whatever they're going to pay, and that becomes the value right there. And they get new money as far as financing, so you don't have to make. One of the big problems that tried to buy the other side out of the house is that you've got to refinance the mortgage. Otherwise, you're in the uncomfortable position of, maybe you sold out your interest in the house, and you gave up the title, but you're still on the mortgage, which means that you can't get another mortgage. The credit reports come.
If it becomes delinquent, oh my.
Yeah, that's right. It can mess up your credit.
Right.
Plus, when the credit reports companies that would go through and TRW and the mortgage companies want to take a look at the mortgage, and they say, oh, Justine, you would qualify ordinarily, but I see you're already on $500,000 debt for your ex-husband's house. You're dead in the water. You're not going to get any financing.
So these are the type of things, if you're a homeowner, you need to think about.
Right. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that retirement is divisible. So, especially if you're in the military or the federal government, and some of these, that's the reason why people take a lot of those jobs, because they got such good benefits. So that's divisible. Not 1/2 of the entire amount of your husband's retirement, but you get half of the retirement that was accrued during the time of marriage. So if he's been a military guy for 20 years, you were married to him for 10 years, you get half the time that you were married. So if he was accruing retirement and married to you half of that time.
During that 10 years.
During the 10 years over the 20, it's the numerator with the denominator, and then you multiply that by half, so you would get a quarter. In that situation, you get a quarter of your husband's retirement.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize that comes into play as well.
They will after they see your podcast.
If the husband or the wife has some type of retirement, they think they can take it away with them. That's not true.
That's definitely not true, and people definitely think that if there's any issue, there's two issues that guys in particular are very, very touchy about. One is their soon-to-be ex-wife trying to grab their retirement, and the other is alimony. I mean, it's very hard to settle cases like that because these guys just don't want to ante up. But it is the law that you're entitled to half of the retirement, so you can force that through if you have to.
Wow.
It's offset, of course, by her retirement. And this is all gender neutral, right?
Oh,
so,
okay,
so
yeah.
you know, you got a retirement plan, I get half of that too.
Right. Okay. So
This
maybe
is if we were married. I'm deciding
this
what
like it kind of wipes each other out if they're both in their careers just as long, right?
Yeah, but again, it depends on who's got the better job, who's got the bigger
Right.
retirement. Yeah. So
Typically, it's the guy.
So sometimes you just value the two retirement plans and offset that, and somebody else takes the house and somebody takes the retirement plan. Or, you know, there's clever ways to do this, and they're actually pretty simple if you get to them soon enough, and you get, you know, you can use divorce mediators, for example.
Yeah, that's a thing I've never heard of before. I saw that on your door.
Yeah.
Mediators.
Well, I've had a divorce with decency mediation clinic for years. I just mediated out a case that had been bouncing around for the better part of a year, bouncing around between attorneys, and I mediated the whole thing out in an hour and a half.
So that's an alternative, a mediator.
And smart.
See, that's another thing I didn't know.
Another
Now I know.
podcast.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
What is this Hussey case?
Well, this is an old case name that talks about the categories of property division. Are we just looking at Hawaii, or is this going to go everywhere? This podcast.
It's going to go everywhere, but it's based in Hawaii.
In Hawaii, but it's not true necessarily in all other jurisdictions. We have categories of property division. So if you have property, you know, going into a marriage, you're worth $1 million as the time you go in. If you can document that, and that million turns into $2 million, the owner spouse gets that first $1 million back. You only get what's accrued during the time of marriage, although you get everything that's accrued during time of marriage. So, so again, let's go back to you and me being married. Kind of an exciting thought. I see how cute you look on this podcast.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm the higher earner, and just because I stuck it in Brad Coates' bank account doesn't mean that Justine doesn't get her half, even though I've been earning more.
Right.
You know that your earnings are all joint. It's the marital partnership theory. So you get half of everything I've got during the time we're married, or everything I earn while we're married. But you don't get half of my first $1 million if I brought that into the marriage. Yeah. Likewise, if I chose my parents correctly and inherited $1 million, you don't get half of that. But you do get half of the appreciation of even separately held previous to marriage property or inherited property.
Earning interest,
stock market increases, property values going up.
All right.
So, you know, again, say you had the dubious good fortune to marry me. You move into my house. I've got a house in Kahala. It's worth $1 million when we get married. Then it goes up to $2 million during the course of the marriage. I get the first $1 million back, but you get half of the appreciation, even though it was my house that appreciated.
Yeah, and that's another thing we're going to go into in a different show is probably prenuptial. So that's a whole different other. That's
the way you get around these. That is the way you get around these. So quickly, we could talk about custody.
Sure.
Custody is broken down into legal custody versus physical custody. Joint, and either of those can either be sole or joint. So you can have sole legal and sole physical custody. If you're the mom, a lot of moms want to try for that. You can have joint legal but sole physical to one parent or the other, or you can have joint where everything's joint. You know, both the legal and the physical custody. Now, the difference between legal custody and physical custody is that legal custody pertains to the macro life-affecting issues in the child's lives. Where they go to school, private versus public, religious upbringing, whether they get married or drive a car, whether they're still a minor or join the Marines or whatever, the kind of stuff that parents have got to sign for their kids for.
Right.
If you've got joint custody, that's got to be decided jointly.
Okay.
Physical custody is who they actually live with. And so you could have joint legal custody where you each have access to the parent-teacher conferences, and both parents have got to choose the course of study in colleges, et cetera, et cetera. But physical custody, the kids live with either mom or dad. And in that case, the non-custodial parent pays child support, and again, that's gender neutral. So if dad gets custody, mom pays child support. It's not like dads pay everything anymore.
And traditionally, we see that the mom has the kids majority of the time.
That probably breaks down that way in the past. A lot of times, historically, I think guys just didn't fight for custody, so they didn't know they could get it, so they didn't get it.
Right.
Nowadays, the court will zero in on joint physical custody the bulk of the time, unless somebody's really a bonehead and has a real problem, maybe a DUI or test dirty for drugs or has spouse abuse issues, or spouse abuse is a deal breaker in these things right away because they attribute a propensity to violence. Even if it's toward the spouse, they worry about that parlaying over for the child as well. So those issues can be deal breakers. But assuming you haven't got any real deal breaker issues, and assuming everybody's staying in Hawaii, which you can't always assume. I mean, a lot of times in Hawaii, one party is going to relocate away from the island, so joint physical custody becomes impossible.
Right.
But if you can get beyond those kinds of issues, then generally the court's going to want to see joint physical custody and try and steer you that way. But like I say, a lot of guys, they're still unaware that they can do that. So the custody does still go the majority of the time to the women, but a far smaller majority than it used to be. I mean, it used to be like 75% of the time the Wahini's got custody, and now it's probably much lower than that.
Yeah, in my case, we have both the physical custody aspect of it. We have our daughter 1 week on, 1 week off.
Yeah, so that's
that's
joint legal and joint physical custody.
Okay.
But you probably notice you don't get a whole lot of child support because that cuts the child support down dramatically because you've only got the child half the time.
Right. It only makes sense that if you have the child majority of the time, you need more financial support.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So in another way to think of it is if the guys are financially strapped, can you say they can, if they're fit, should do more of time with the child so they don't have to pay
well, you can, but I mean, people don't want to give up extra time with their kids, just to jockey child support very often. I mean, people want the time that they can get with their kids. If they can get half the time, they're going to take half the time.
Yeah.
So, you start, and you've got to not only put it in your divorce decree, you've got to, walk the walk thereafter. If you put in that you're going to take joint physical custody, but the Wahini winds up doing most of the heavy lifting, and the guy just disappears and is typical guy, then the woman's getting basically screwed as far as not getting the full child support.
And you would have to revisit the whole thing.
Yeah. And anything regarding kids can be revisited all the way through age 18 or age 23.
Yeah, that's good.
So you can have child custody be structured one way, and then that parent craps out and doesn't really do a great job, or gets arrested, or starts to live with a crackhead, or starts a meth lab in the former marital residence. That's a good way to lose custody. So you can bring in that evidence, and even just failure to really exercise your full time with the child. If somebody keeps a daytimer and says, "Hey, I agreed to joint custody, but I thought he was going to step up to the line." Turns out he's really only had him on weekends, and that's closer to being full custody to mom with reasonable visitation to dad.
Do we have something in Hawaii called deadbeat dad?
Well, I think everywhere they have deadbeat dads. I mean, they have the issue of whether or not guys that are ordered to pay child support actually continue, fully pay it, and that used to be a huge problem. And then they actually goes back to the President Reagan, who figured out that if the parents who really had the kids didn't pay the child support, then the mom, in those days it was oftentimes the mom, winds up on public assistance that the taxpayers are paying support. So they cracked down and made a mandatory child support set of guidelines nationwide, and they made mandatory payments through something called the CSEA, the Child Support Enforcement Agency. So it's not just the woman, like it was when I first started practicing, the wife trying to chase the ex-wife trying to chase those, "Oh, please give me my child support." Now it gets deducted right out of his paycheck and gets sent to the CSEA and then sent to mom.
Yeah, that's good.
So it's a major difference.
So now here, do we want to cover these miscellaneous, or do you think that's a whole different ball of wax?
Well, in the miscellaneous issues, I had talked about prenuptials. Prenups, a lot of people don't think they're worth the paper they're written on, because there's always this kind of misinformed assumption that you really can't govern. And it used to be that they were unenforceable, but then states have started passing. We passed a uniform premarital act back in, I think it was the late 80s, and they are, if they're done correctly now, they are going to be enforceable. So to do them correctly means you got to have the opportunity for counsel on both sides. You got to have full disclosure of finances on both sides. But you can, in that situation, you can agree. You can say, okay, I'll marry you, Justine, but you're not going to get any. You're not going to get any of my money out of the deal.
I imagine, because I've never been through it before, but I imagine that it's kind of like an emotional thing for either side, especially where mostly it would be the woman, right? Where they want to get married, but he says, "Here, honey, I'd like you to have a prenuptial." And I imagine it's kind of like a, "Oh, you don't trust me" type of thing. You know what I mean?
It's exactly what it's like. Sure.
I mean, do you see this often? A lot?
Yeah. I mean, that is the public relations issue that goes along with prenups is, how do you present it to your spouse, and
Yeah.
is she going to agree? And then if she
Yeah.
doesn't agree, what's going to happen?
Yeah, because
And you got to do it far enough in advance of the wedding so that it doesn't turn into duress or